A millionaire followed a little beggar girl who robbed him on the street. When the millionaire saw what the beggar girl was going to do, he started to cry. On the busy avenue, the afternoon sun punished passers-by, but Lewis Grant walked as if the heat couldn't touch his aura of power. His expensive Italian suit and watch from a luxury brand were symbols of the empire he had built by crushing anyone who dared to cross his path. At 45, his prematurely grey hair and eyes as cold as obsidian commanded respect and fear wherever he went. The businessman was about to make a call when he felt a soft bump. At first he didn't pay attention. After all, the sidewalk was crowded. Seconds later, when he put his hand in his jacket's inner pocket, his face began to contort into a mask of fury. His wallet had disappeared. Spinning on his heels with the speed of a snake about to strike, his eyes caught the small silhouette moving away. "Stop right there, you thief!" His voice thundered down the avenue, making several people turn around. "How you don't know who you're messing with?" Upon hearing the shout, the girl darted into the crowd like a frightened cat. Lewis watched, stunned, as she skillfully dodged between people. A child? He thought, feeling his blood boil in his veins. Her child had the audacity to rob me. His wounded pride turned into an unrestrained fury that made his hands tremble. Lewis adjusted his Italian silk tie in an automatic gesture, while a perverse smile formed on his face. He wouldn't call the police, no, that would be too easy. "Come back here, you little rat," he shouted again, starting the pursuit. His firm steps echoed on the pavement as he forcefully opened a path between the passers-by. "I'll teach this street thief personally what happens when you steal from Lewis Grant." People shied away in fright as they saw the imposing man running with an enraged expression on his face. Some street vendors had to jump aside when the girl ran past their stalls, knocking over some merchandise. Lewis stepped on the fallen products without caring, his eyes fixed on his prey. "Run while you can," he muttered through gritted teeth. "The more you run, the more painful your lesson will be." The businessman maintained a relentless pace, his breathing controlled by years of boxing at an exclusive club. Every time the girl looked back, he could see the growing terror in her dark eyes. "No use trying to run away," he shouted, savoring the fear on her dirty face. "I can chase you all day, you street rat." The pursuit led them through increasingly narrow alleys, where the smell of food and the hum of people created an atmosphere that Lewis despised. The girl knocked over boxes and trash cans in her path, trying to slow him down, but he leaped over the obstacles with the agility of a predator. "Pathetic," he thought with disdain. "Your childish tactics are only prolonging the inevitable." Sweat was already soaking his Egyptian cotton shirt, but Lewis didn't slow down. He saw how the girl's movements became more uncoordinated, fatigue beginning to take its toll. "You're getting tired," he taunted, his voice echoing between the narrow walls. "You won't last much longer, you little thief." The streets grew darker as they moved away from the main avenue. Lewis could see he was trapping his prey exactly where he wanted her. At every corner, the escape options dwindled. "The rat is entering the trap," he thought with cruel satisfaction, seeing the girl hesitate at a fork. The girl's panic was palpable now, her movements losing that initial feline grace. Lewis maintained his inexorable pace, savoring every moment of terror he inflicted. "Look at her," he thought with a cruel smile, trembling like a cornered animal. "Soon she'll learn that no one steals from Lewis Grant and gets away with it." The shadows of the buildings grew longer as the girl finally succumbed to total desperation. Lewis watched with malicious satisfaction as she darted towards a dark alley, her worn sandals frantically hitting the pavement. "A predictable and stupid choice," he thought, stopping at the alley's entrance. "Now you have nowhere else to run, little rat." Lewis adjusted his shirt cuffs as he contemplated the darkness of the alley where his prey had hidden. His eyes, cold as steel, gleamed with a perverse satisfaction. "Let's see how long you can hide in the shadows," he murmured, his voice laden with threat. "The lesson I'm going to teach you today will make you wish you had never crossed my path." Lewis entered the alley with deliberately slow steps, letting the echo of his Italian shoes announce his approach. The little light that penetrated between the buildings cast elongated shadows, but his eyes had already adapted to the gloom. The smell of garbage and dampness didn't seem to bother him. It was just another setting for his revenge. "I can hear you breathing, little rat." His voice cut through the air like a razor. "Your heart must be beating as loudly as the coins you stole from me." The sound of crinkling paper and clinking coins caught his attention. Taking a few more steps, Lewis made out the girl's silhouette crouched behind a rusty trash can. Her hands trembled as she frantically counted the money, her dirty fingers quickly passing over the bills. "What a touching scene," he taunted with a cruel smile. "Counting your little stolen treasure like a rat with its crumbs." Penny froze upon hearing the voice, the crumpled bills still clutched tightly between her thin fingers. Cold sweat ran down her dirty face, mingling with the alley's dust. Her wide eyes stared at the imposing figure blocking her only escape route. "Please, sir." Her voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. "I didn't mean... I needed." Lewis laughed, a humorless sound echoing off the alley walls. He took another step forward, pleased to see the girl shrinking further against the wall. The faint light spilling from the main street partially illuminated his face, accentuating the expression of disdain. "Do you know how much this suit you dared touch with your filthy hands costs?" he asked, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "More than you could steal in an entire year." In a desperate move, Penny tried to run past him, her skinny legs propelling her forward like a cornered gazelle. Yet the uneven alley floor conspired against her. "No, no, no!" she cried out as she felt her foot catch in a hole. "Please, no!" The impact with the ground was violent, ripping a sharp cry of pain from her chapped lips. Her knee scraped against the rough asphalt, tearing both the fabric and the skin beneath. Blood began staining the tattered cloth, but the physical pain was lesser than the terror she felt. Get up, her mind screamed in panic. "You need to run." Lewis watched the scene with perverse pleasure, slowly approaching the fallen girl. His steps were calculated, like a cat toying with its prey before the final pounce. Penny's muffled sobbing was music to his ears. "How disappointing," he taunted, stopping a few meters away from her. "I thought street rats were supposed to be nimbler." Penny tried to crawl away, but her knee throbbed intensely. Blood now dripped onto the dirty ground, forming small, dark puddles. Her hands shook so violently she could barely prop herself up. "Sir, please," she pleaded, thick tears carving trails down her grimy face. "I can explain." The fine leather wallet had fallen during her tumble, spilling notes and cards across the filthy alley floor. Lewis bent to retrieve his belongings, his eyes never leaving the trembling figure before him. "Explain," he questioned with false curiosity. "Explain how you had the audacity to steal from Lewis Grant. This ought to be interesting." The sound of sirens in the distance made Penny cower even further. Her sobs echoed through the alley, mingling with the distant noise from the avenue. Her injured knee pulsed, but it was her heart that seemed about to burst from fear. "Don't turn me into the police," she begged, her voice choked with tears. "Me mama, she's dying." Lewis paused for a moment, arching an eyebrow in a mix of surprise and disdain. He watched as the girl's tears now streamed freely, creating shiny trails on her dirty face. "A sad story to move the wicked man?" he mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really think that's going to work? That I'll believe that?" Penny mustered what little courage she had left, forcing herself to meet those ice-cold eyes. Her hands clenched together, knuckles white with tension. Each word came out broken by sobs. "It's not a lie," she managed to say through tears. "Please." She needs medicine." The businessman adjusted his silk tie, an automatic habit betraying his discomfort with the unexpected situation. The girl's crying echoed through the alley, piercing even his armor of indifference. "And why should I believe you?" he challenged, his voice still hard but with an almost imperceptible note of hesitation. "Why didn't you rob a pharmacy then?" The sirens sounded closer now, making Penny squirm in fear. Her knee bled more profusely, staining the concrete beneath her. With her back pressed against the cold wall, she looked even smaller and more fragile. "Please, Mr. Grant," she pleaded, her voice almost fading. "The medicine is so expensive. She'll die without it. I'd do anything for her. I know it's wrong to steal, but I can't let her. I can't lose her." The girl spoke, tears flooding her huge, childlike eyes. Lewis took another step forward, his shadow now completely covering the small, curled-up figure. The girl's tears reflected the scarce light trickling into the alley, glistening like diamonds on her soiled face. The powerful businessman, accustomed to ruining lives without batting an eye, found himself at an unexpected crossroads. "So tell me, little thief," his voice came dangerously soft, Why shouldn't I call the police right now? Penny raised her tear-stained face, her dark eyes meeting the businessman's in one last desperate appeal. Her whole body trembled, part in pain, part in fear, but mostly in desperation. "If I go to jail," she whispered between uncontrollable sobs, "who will take care of her? My mum. She has no one else in the world but me." Lewis stared at the sobbing girl in disbelief, his cold eyes analyzing every tremble of her injured frame. Her knee still bled, staining the filthy alley floor, but it was the despair in her voice that started to unsettle him in a way he couldn't explain. Years of empire building had taught him to spot lies, and something about that crying felt disturbingly genuine. "Prove it," he finally said, his voice still harsh. "Prove you're not lying, or I'll call the police right now." Penny swallowed hard, trying to control the sobs racking her small body. With trembling hands, she wiped the tears staining her grimy face and tried to stand, stifling a groan of pain as she put weight on her injured knee. "My name is Penny." Her voice came out shaky but firm. "And I can show you I'm telling the truth if you come with me." The businessman let out a humorless laugh, adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist in a gesture of impatience. The idea of following a street thief to some unknown place seemed ridiculous, but his curiosity had been piqued. Something about the way she pronounced her own name, with a dignity that contradicted her tattered clothes, intrigued him. "If this is a trick," he warned, his voice low and threatening, "you'll wish you'd been handed over to the police." Penny began to limp toward the alley exit, each step an exercise in determination not to show the pain she felt. Blood still trickled from her knee, leaving a macabre trail on the ground, but she refused to slow her pace. "It's not far," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Hold on, Mum. I'm coming back." The streets grew increasingly dilapidated as they progressed. Lewis watched the peeling facades of the buildings, the broken windows, and the accumulated trash on the sidewalks with growing discomfort. His Italian suit and expensive shoes seemed out of place in that scene of poverty. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded to know, his voice betraying a hint of concern. "This doesn't seem like the kind of place where someone would keep expensive medicines." The girl stopped in front of a small, dimly lit pharmacy, its half-empty shelves visible through the dusty window. Her hands were trembling as she pointed inside. "The medicines are in there," she said in a choked voice. "Each box is quite expensive, and she needs 3 per month. That's what I was trying to get." The establishment was small and poorly lit, with dusty shelves and haphazardly arranged products. The middle-aged pharmacist with a tired expression looked at Penny suspiciously, his gaze lingering on her tattered clothes and injured knee. "My mum's medicines," she said, her voice trembling slightly. 3 boxes of the—" "I'll take care of it," Lewis interrupted, pulling out his recovered wallet. His fingers flipped through the high-denomination bills, and he noticed the pharmacist's eyes widen at the amount of cash. The girl beside him held her breath, her hands nervously clutching the hem of her worn shirt. You're going to pay for my mom's medicines?" she asked in a choked voice, her huge, childlike eyes flooding with tears. The businessman ignored the question, keeping his expression neutral as he addressed the pharmacist. "How much for each box?" he asked bluntly. The man behind the counter stuttered the price, impressed by the imposing figure in his Italian suit. Lewis nodded, placing the total amount on the counter without blinking. "How long has your mother been sick?" he asked the girl, purposefully avoiding her earlier question. Penny swallowed hard, watching the pharmacist hurry to retrieve the medicines. 3 months, she replied softly, her eyes fixed on the boxes being piled on the counter. "At first we could buy them, but then—" Her voice faltered and she quickly wiped a tear with the back of her dirty hand. "Insurance doesn't cover it, and each box costs more than a month's rent." Lewis pocketed the change, taking the bag with the medicines. His face remained an impassive mask, but something inside him twisted at the way the girl's eyes followed his every move, as if fearing he might change his mind at any moment. "Where to now?" he asked in a firm voice, though softer than before. "And it better not be another trick." Penny limped to the door, clutching the bag of medicines against her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed the way. "It's near here," she said, her voice carrying an urgency it hadn't before. "Mom needs to take it as soon as possible. She wasn't doing well when I left." The path to Penny's house was short, but each step seemed to weigh a ton. The old building stood like a ghost among equally dilapidated ones, its stained walls telling tales of better times. Penny could barely contain her anxiety. "It's here," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pushed open the broken door. "Please don't judge by appearances." The inside of the house was even more bleak than the outside. Old worn furniture cluttered a small space, and the smell of mold mingled with something more worrying, the telltale odor of sickness. Lewis felt his stomach churn, not from the poverty of the place, but from the raw authenticity of the situation. "Where's your mum?" he asked, his voice losing some of its previous edge. "Why is it so quiet?" Penny limped quickly into the house, calling for her mother with increasing panic in her voice. The silence that answered made her heart race even faster. Lewis followed her, his Italian shoes creaking on the rotting floorboards. "Mom!" The girl's voice trembled. "Please answer." The dim light filtering through the grimy windows revealed a scene that made both their blood run cold. On the floor of the small living room, a woman lay motionless. Her dark hair fanned out around her pale face, her lips slightly purplish. "No, no, no." Penny threw herself beside her, completely forgetting the pain in her own knee. "Mom, wake up, please, wake up." Lewis remained frozen in the doorway, watching the scene with an indescribable expression. For the first time in years, the powerful businessman didn't know how to react. Penny's genuine distress and the frail figure on the floor began to crack his armor of indifference. "Is she—" he began to ask, his voice strangely hoarse. "Does she need help?" The girl was now sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking slightly against her mother's. Her tears fell on Megan's motionless face as her small hands desperately searched for signs of life. "Please," she begged no one in particular, her voice broken with pain. "Don't leave me alone, Mommy. I got the medicines. I'm here." The distant sound of a siren cut through the air, making Lewis start. His eyes wandered from the still body on the floor to the distraught girl, and for the first time in his life, the man who built an empire destroying lives felt the crushing weight of his choices. "If I had believed before," he thought, a bitter taste filling his mouth. "If I hadn't wasted so much time with my petty revenge." Lewis finally snapped out of his stupor, quickly advancing to check Megan's vital signs. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched her neck, searching for a pulse. Time seemed to have stopped in that miserable room, as 3 lives hung by an invisible thread. "There's still time," he murmured to himself, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "There has to be time." With shaking fingers, Lewis dialed the emergency number on his cell phone, his eyes fixed on Megan's unconscious form on the floor. Penny was kneeling beside her mother, gently shaking her shoulders, begging her to wake up. The operator answered on the first call, and Lewis surprised himself with the desperation in his own voice. "I need an ambulance immediately," he ordered, his mask of coldness completely forgotten. "We have an unconscious woman, weak breathing. Come quickly, please." In less than 10 minutes, which seemed like an eternity, the sound of sirens began echoing through the narrow streets. Lewis ran outside, frantically waving to guide the paramedics to the house. His expensive shoes sank into the mud, but for the first time in his life he didn't care about his appearance. "This way," he shouted, his voice hoarse with concern. "Quick, she's getting worse." The paramedic team stormed into the small house with professional efficiency, carrying equipment and a stretcher. Their movements were swift and precise as they checked Megan's vital signs. Penny refused to let go of her mother's hand until one of the responders gently pulled her away to work. "Very low pressure," one of them announced, connecting monitors. "We need to take her now." Lewis surprised everyone, including himself, when he stepped forward and lifted the woman into his arms. His Italian suit, which just hours ago was a symbol of his power, now stained with the unconscious woman's cold sweat. Carefully he helped place her on the stretcher, feeling how frighteningly light she was. "We're coming with her," he declared, his voice allowing no arguments. "The girl is her daughter." Minutes later, the sound of the siren cut through the air as the ambulance tore through the city streets. Inside the vehicle, the paramedics worked frantically over Megan's unconscious body, while Penny held her cold hand, tears silently streaming down her dirty face. Lewis, seated on the opposite bench, watched the scene with a tortured expression, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles were white. "Please don't die," the girl sobbed. I promise I'll never steal again, but don't leave me alone." The hospital corridors blurred as the stretcher was quickly pushed through by the medical team. Penny ran alongside, limping and completely ignoring the pain in her own injured knee. Lewis followed her, his expensive suit disheveled and stained with Megan's blood from when he carried her to the ambulance. "Weak pulse, pressure dropping," one of the doctors shouted. "We need immediate access." The emergency room doors slammed shut with a dull thud, leaving Penny and Lewis outside. The girl pounded the door with her small fists, an anguished cry escaping her throat. The businessman, on an impulse he didn't even understand himself, held her trembling shoulders, preventing her from further injuring her already bruised hands. "They'll take care of her now," he said with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. "You need to be strong." The hours dragged in the sterile hospital corridor. Penny was curled up in one of the waiting room chairs, her red-rimmed eyes fixed on the doors her mother had disappeared through. Lewis paced back and forth, his cell phone forgotten in the pocket of his stained coat. The sound of his Italian shoes echoed through the empty hallway, marking the seconds like a macabre clock. "If she dies because of me," he thought, running his hands through his graying hair. "How will I live with that?" A nurse approached with a first aid kit, insisting on cleaning and bandaging Penny's knee. The girl barely registered the pain as the wound was treated, her thoughts focused solely on her mother. Lewis watched the procedure, feeling a pang of guilt at seeing the injury she got during the escape from him. "I should have believed her from the start," his mind tortured him. "How much time did we waste with my thirst for revenge?" The sound of doors opening made them both startle. A doctor emerged from the restricted area, his face grave as he approached. Penny stood up so quickly she nearly fell, her small body trembling with anxiety. Lewis instinctively took a step forward, positioning himself beside her as if to shield her from what was to come. "How is she?" they asked in unison, their voices laced with dread. The doctor consulted his clipboard, his tired eyes moving between the dirty girl and the businessman in his stained suit. The incongruity of the pair seemed to confuse him for a moment, but he maintained his professionalism. "We managed to stabilize her," he began, his voice measured, "but the condition is very serious." Penny grabbed Lewis's coat sleeve, her wobbly legs barely able to keep her upright. The businessman, without thinking, placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. The doctor continued explaining the situation, using technical terms that made the girl's head spin. "Please," she interrupted with a trembling voice, "just say if she'll be okay." The silence that followed her question was deafening. The doctor adjusted his coat, carefully choosing his next words. Lewis could feel Penny shaking under his hand, and something in his chest tightened painfully. "The next few hours will be crucial," the doctor finally answered. "We're doing everything we can." A medical team continued coming in and out of the emergency room, carrying equipment and medication bags. Every movement was followed by Penny's watchful eyes, who refused to sit down again. Lewis had loosened his tie, giving up on trying to maintain his always impeccable appearance. "How much would it cost to transfer her to a private room?" he asked abruptly. "The best room you have." The doctor hesitated before answering, looking back and forth between the two of them. His expression became even more grave when he began to explain the situation in detail. The numbers he mentioned made Penny feel dizzy, but Lewis just nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Do whatever is necessary," he ordered with his business voice. "Cost is not an issue." The following hours were a blur of beeping monitors and running doctors. Penny watched it all with terror-stricken eyes, while Lewis used his influence to ensure Megan received the best possible treatment. The businessman made several calls, moving bureaucratic mountains with the ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. "She needs to survive," he muttered to himself between one call and the next. "I can't have this death on my conscience." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the lead doctor came back to talk to them. His face was marked by exhaustion after hours of intense work. Penny approached him like a sleepwalker, her legs barely supporting her. Lewis stopped by her side, unconsciously holding her small dirty hand. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Tell me she'll be okay." The doctor took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses in a nervous gesture. His eyes fixed on Penny with a compassion that made Lewis's heart freeze. "We managed to stabilize her," he began slowly. "But I need to be honest with you. The time she spent without treatment," his voice failed for a moment. "The time she spent without treatment caused very serious complications. Lewis felt Penny squeeze his hand hard as the doctor continued explaining the gravity of the situation. Every word was like a stab in his chest, reminding him of the precious time he lost chasing a desperate child through the streets. The doctor spoke of organ damage, complications, and reduced chances, but all Lewis could hear was the silent crying of the girl beside him. The time we lost today, he thought bitterly, guilt consuming him. It may have cost her life. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hospital hallway. A police officer entered the waiting area. His heavy steps echoed on the linoleum floor as his eyes methodically examined every person present. Lewis noticed his presence first, a cold sensation spreading through his chest as he noticed the officer's gaze settle on Penny. The exhausted, worried girl didn't even notice the approaching authority. Not now, the businessman thought, standing up. Not when everything is already so difficult. The officer approached with the determination of someone who had already found his target. His impeccable uniform contrasted with Penny's dirty, rumpled clothes as she still clutched the medicine she had bought for her mother. "Penny Ruiz," the officer's voice sounded too loud in the silent hallway. "I need you to come with me." Lewis instinctively placed himself between the officer and the girl, his body tense like a violin string about to snap. Years of difficult negotiations had taught him to stay calm in tense situations, but his voice betrayed his concern. "Officer, this young girl is going through an extremely delicate moment," he argued, using his most diplomatic tone. "Her mother is in critical condition." The officer shook his head, unmoved by the appeal. He took a paper out of his pocket and handed it to Lewis, who took it with hands struggling to remain steady. It was an arrest warrant, listing a series of petty thefts around the area. "I'm sorry, sir," said the officer, his voice professional and distant, "but she has a long record. This time we can't ignore it. We've been looking for her for weeks, and when someone reported a homeless girl at the hospital, we came to check. She's coming with me." Penny seemed to have shrunk in her chair, her eyes wide with fear alternating between the officer and the doors leading to the emergency room where her mother was fighting for her life. The tears she had been trying to hold back began to silently stream down her dirty face. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My mum, she needs me here." Lewis tried to use all his influence, offering to pay bail, promising to take responsibility for the girl, but the officer remained unyielding. Every argument was countered with regulations and procedures, cold words that didn't take the desperation of the situation into account. "I can't just ignore the law," the officer declared, already reaching for the handcuffs. "Even if you are who you are." The metallic sound of the handcuffs being unlocked seemed to awaken something in Penny. She jumped up, her small hands grasping Lewis's arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me," she pleaded, panic evident in her voice. "How will I know if she's okay? Please, my mum. I have to be here with her." The hospital hallway turned into a chaotic scene. Penny struggled as the officer tried to handcuff her, her pleas echoing off the walls. Lewis argued louder and louder, his normally controlled face twisted with frustration. "She's just a desperate child," he thundered, his voice drawing the attention of nurses and other patients. "Where is your humanity?" Amidst the commotion, a shrill, continuous sound cut through the air, the alarm of one of the monitors in the emergency room. The doors burst open violently, and a medical team rushed in, shouts of "Emergency!" echoing down the hallway. The color drained from Penny's face as she recognized the room number. "Mom!" she screamed, trying to break free. "No, let me go!" "She needs me." Lewis felt his heart tighten as he watched the girl being handcuffed while crying desperately. The officer held her firmly, but his eyes betrayed an internal conflict at the scene. More doctors were running towards the emergency room, carrying equipment and shouting orders. "Is this your job?" Lewis provoked bitterly. "Arresting a child while her mother dies?" The chaos in the hallway increased with every passing second. Nurses rushed with emergency carts, doctors shouted for more medication, and amidst it all, Penny was dragged towards the exit, her pleas becoming more and more desperate. Lewis felt torn, his eyes alternating between the emergency room doors and the girl being taken away. How did everything go so wrong? He thought, anguished. How did I let this happen? The handcuffs seemed absurdly large on Penny's thin wrists as she continued struggling and begging to stay. Her face was stained with tears, and her injured knee had started bleeding again from the effort. Lewis tried one last time. "Don't take her, please. Wait until we know how her mother is." But his voice was drowned out by a new alarm coming from the emergency room. The doctor rushed out of the room, shouting orders to prepare the transfer Lewis had requested for the girl's mother. His words were technical, but his urgent tone made the gravity of the situation clear. Penny managed to hear only fragments: cardiac arrest, unstable, risk of death, before being pushed further away. "No!" she screamed with all the strength she had. "Let me stay with her, please!" Lewis watched helplessly as Penny was taken towards the police car, her pleas echoing further and further away. At the same time, a team rushed with Megan's stretcher towards the transfer ambulance, monitors beeping and doctors shouting instructions. "What have I done?" he thought, guilt consuming him. "If I had believed her before." The last glimpse Lewis had was of Penny being placed in the police car, her handcuffed hands pressed against the glass, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched the ambulance carrying her mother depart in the opposite direction. The sound of sirens mingled with her sobs, creating a symphony of despair that Lewis knew he would never forget. "I'll fix this," he promised himself, his voice choked. "Even if it's the last thing I do." The private hospital was a completely different world from the previous one. Quiet, well-lit hallways replaced the chaos of the public emergency room, but the tension in the air remained the same. Lewis observed through the ICU glass as the medical team worked tirelessly on Megan. The monitors continued beeping at an irregular rhythm, each sound off-pattern making his heart jump. "I can't let her die," he muttered to himself, running his hands through his graying hair. "Not after separating a mother and daughter." The hours dragged on as doctors and nurses came in and out of the room, always wearing worried expressions. Lewis had completely abandoned his usual ruthless businessman demeanor. His suit was still stained, the tie long discarded, and deep dark circles marked his face. His phone kept ringing with urgent business matters, but for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. How can they talk about contracts now? He thought bitterly, rejecting another call. There's a life at stake here. The head of the medical team approached with a grave expression, carrying a stack of test results. His words were carefully chosen, but Lewis could feel the weight of the unspoken in every pause. The medical terms jumbled in his mind, but the message was clear. They were losing the battle. "We need someone who can help her," Lewis decided, interrupting the doctor's explanation. "Who is the best specialist in the country for this type of case?" With trembling but determined fingers, Lewis began making calls. His name opened doors, his money broke down obstacles, but still, time seemed to be running against them. Each call was more urgent than the last, his normally controlled voice carrying a pleading tone that surprised even his oldest contacts. "I don't care how much it costs," he repeated with each negotiation. "Bring them here now." The sound of Megan's monitors was his only concern, each irregular beep a reminder of what was truly at stake. Money has never seemed so useless, he thought, watching another transfer being performed. What good is all this power if I can't save a life? The arrival of the specialist caused a stir at the hospital. His reputation preceded him, and the regular medical team watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension as he examined Megan's records. Lewis remained by the ICU door, his eyes alternating between Megan's pale face and the doctor's reactions to each new piece of information. "She needs to live," his mind repeated like a mantra. "I need to bring good news to Penny." The following hours were an endless sequence of new tests and procedures. The specialist worked with absolute concentration, requesting tests Lewis had never heard of. Each result was analyzed meticulously, every detail considered with meticulous attention. "There's something we're missing," the doctor muttered more to himself than to the others. "Something that doesn't fit the usual pattern." Lewis observed every move, every expression of the specialist, trying to decipher any clue about Megan's condition. The other doctors seemed to do the same, their tense expressions revealing the gravity of the situation. The sound of the machines had become a morbid symphony, marking the passage of time. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Lewis asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "Is there anything we can do?" The specialist looked up from the test results, his face revealing a concern that made Lewis's stomach sink. The papers in his hands trembled slightly as he approached, his usually neutral expression replaced by something darker. "In 30 years of practice," he began, his voice low and controlled, "I've never seen a combination of symptoms like this." Lewis felt his blood run cold. Years of tough negotiations had taught him to read people, and something in the doctor's posture deeply alarmed him. The specialist went on talking, his words carefully chosen, but each one felt like a hammer blow. "There's a complication," he explained, showing a series of tests, something the normal protocols didn't foresee. A medical team continued coming in and out of the emergency room, carrying equipment and medication bags. Every movement was followed by Penny's watchful eyes, who refused to sit down again. Lewis had loosened his tie, giving up on trying to maintain his always impeccable appearance. "How much would it cost to transfer her to a private room?" he asked abruptly. "The best room you have." The doctor hesitated before answering, looking back and forth between the two of them. His expression became even more grave when he began to explain the situation in detail. The numbers he mentioned made Penny feel dizzy, but Lewis just nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Do whatever is necessary," he ordered with his business voice. "Cost is not an issue." The following hours were a blur of beeping monitors and running doctors. Penny watched it all with terror-stricken eyes, while Lewis used his influence to ensure Megan received the best possible treatment. The businessman made several calls, moving bureaucratic mountains with the ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. "She needs to survive," he muttered to himself between one call and the next. "I can't have this death on my conscience." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the lead doctor came back to talk to them. His face was marked by exhaustion after hours of intense work. Penny approached him like a sleepwalker, her legs barely supporting her. Lewis stopped by her side, unconsciously holding her small, dirty hand. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Tell me she'll be okay." The doctor took a deep breath, adjusting his glasses in a nervous gesture. His eyes fixed on Penny with a compassion that made Lewis's heart freeze. "We managed to stabilize her," he began slowly. "But I need to be honest with you. The time she spent without treatment," his voice failed for a moment, "the time she spent without treatment caused very serious complications." Lewis felt Penny squeeze his hand hard as the doctor continued explaining the gravity of the situation. Every word was like a stab in his chest, reminding him of the precious time he lost chasing a desperate child through the streets. The doctor spoke of organ damage, complications, and reduced chances, but all Lewis could hear was the silent crying of the girl beside him. "The time we lost today," he thought bitterly, guilt consuming him. "It may have cost her life." Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hospital hallway. A police officer entered the waiting area. His heavy steps echoed on the linoleum floor as his eyes methodically examined every person present. Lewis noticed his presence first, a cold sensation spreading through his chest as he noticed the officer's gaze settle on Penny. The exhausted, worried girl didn't even notice the approaching authority. "Not now," the businessman thought, standing up. "Not when everything is already so difficult." The officer approached with the determination of someone who had already found his target. His impeccable uniform contrasted with Penny's dirty, rumpled clothes as she still clutched the medicine she had bought for her mother. "Penny Ruiz," the officer's voice sounded too loud in the silent hallway. "I need you to come with me." Lewis instinctively placed himself between the officer and the girl, his body tense like a violin string about to snap. Years of difficult negotiations had taught him to stay calm in tense situations, but his voice betrayed his concern. "Officer, this young girl is going through an extremely delicate moment," he argued, using his most diplomatic tone. "Her mother is in critical condition." The officer shook his head, unmoved by the appeal. He took a paper out of his pocket and handed it to Lewis, who took it with hands struggling to remain steady. It was an arrest warrant, listing a series of petty thefts around the area. "I'm sorry, sir," said the officer, his voice professional and distant, "but she has a long record. This time we can't ignore it. We've been looking for her for weeks, and when someone reported a homeless girl at the hospital, we came to check. She's coming with me." Penny seemed to have shrunk in her chair, her eyes wide with fear alternating between the officer and the doors leading to the emergency room where her mother was fighting for her life. The tears she had been trying to hold back began to silently stream down her dirty face. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My mum, She needs me here." Lewis tried to use all his influence, offering to pay bail, promising to take responsibility for the girl, but the officer remained unyielding. Every argument was countered with regulations and procedures, cold words that didn't take the desperation of the situation into account. "I can't just ignore the law," the officer declared, already reaching for the handcuffs. "Even if you are who you are." The metallic sound of the handcuffs being unlocked seemed to awaken something in Penny. She jumped up, her small hands grasping Lewis's arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me," she pleaded, panic evident in her voice. "How will I know if she's okay? Please, my mum. I have to be here with her." The hospital hallway turned into a chaotic scene. Penny struggled as the officer tried to handcuff her, her pleas echoing off the walls. Lewis argued louder and louder, his normally controlled face twisted with frustration. "She's just a desperate child," he thundered, his voice drawing the attention of nurses and other patients. "Where is your humanity?" Amidst the commotion, a shrill, continuous sound cut through the air, the alarm of one of the monitors in the emergency room. The doors burst open violently, and a medical team rushed in, shouts of "Emergency!" echoing down the hallway. The color drained from Penny's face as she recognized the room number. "Mom!" she screamed, trying to break free. "No, let me go!" "She needs me." Lewis felt his heart tighten as he watched the girl being handcuffed while crying desperately. The officer held her firmly, but his eyes betrayed an internal conflict at the scene. More doctors were running towards the emergency room, carrying equipment and shouting orders. "Is this your job?" Lewis provoked bitterly. "Arresting a child while her mother dies?" The chaos in the hallway increased with every passing second. Nurses rushed with emergency carts, doctors shouted for more medication, and amidst it all, Penny was dragged towards the exit, her pleas becoming more and more desperate. Lewis felt torn, his eyes alternating between the emergency room doors and the girl being taken away. How did everything go so wrong? He thought, anguished. How did I let this happen? The handcuffs seemed absurdly large on Penny's thin wrists as she continued struggling and begging to stay. Her face was stained with tears, and her injured knee had started bleeding again from the effort. Lewis tried one last time. "Don't take her, please. Wait until we know how her mother is." But his voice was drowned out by a new alarm coming from the emergency room. The doctor rushed out of the room, shouting orders to prepare the transfer Lewis had requested for the girl's mother. His words were technical, but his urgent tone made the gravity of the situation clear. Penny managed to hear only fragments: cardiac arrest, unstable, risk of death, before being pushed further away. "No!" she screamed with all the strength she had. "Let me stay with her, please!" Lewis watched helplessly as Penny was taken towards the police car, her pleas echoing further and further away. At the same time, a team rushed with Megan's stretcher towards the transfer ambulance, monitors beeping and doctors shouting instructions. "What have I done?" he thought, guilt consuming him. If I had believed her before. The last glimpse Lewis had was of Penny being placed in the police car, her handcuffed hands pressed against the glass, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched the ambulance carrying her mother depart in the opposite direction. The sound of sirens mingled with her sobs, creating a symphony of despair that Lewis knew he would never forget. "I'll fix this," he promised himself, his voice choked. "Even if it's the last thing I do." The private hospital was a completely different world from the previous one. Quiet, well-lit hallways replaced the chaos of the public emergency room, but the tension in the air remained the same. Lewis observed through the ICU glass as the medical team worked tirelessly on Megan. The monitors continued beeping at an irregular rhythm, each sound off-pattern making his heart jump. "I can't let her die," he muttered to himself, running his hands through his graying hair. "Not after separating a mother and daughter." The hours dragged on as doctors and nurses came in and out of the room, always wearing worried expressions. Lewis had completely abandoned his usual ruthless businessman demeanor. His suit was still stained, the tie long discarded, and deep dark circles marked his face. His phone kept ringing with urgent business matters, but for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. How can they talk about contracts now? He thought bitterly, rejecting another call. There's a life at stake here. The head of the medical team approached with a grave expression, carrying a stack of test results. His words were carefully chosen, but Lewis could feel the weight of the unspoken in every pause. The medical terms jumbled in his mind, but the message was clear. They were losing the battle. "We need someone who can help her," Lewis decided, interrupting the doctor's explanation. "Who is the best specialist in the country for this type of case?" With trembling but determined fingers, Lewis began making calls. His name opened doors, his money broke down obstacles, but still, time seemed to be running against them. Each call was more urgent than the last, his normally controlled voice carrying a pleading tone that surprised even his oldest contacts. "I don't care how much it costs," he repeated with each negotiation. "Bring them here now." The sound of Megan's monitors was his only concern, each irregular beep a reminder of what was truly at stake. Money has never seemed so useless, he thought, watching another transfer being performed. What good is all this power if I can't save a life? The arrival of the specialist caused a stir at the hospital. His reputation preceded him, and the regular medical team watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension as he examined Megan's records. Lewis remained by the ICU door, his eyes alternating between Megan's pale face and the doctor's reactions to each new piece of information. "She needs to live," his mind repeated like a mantra. "I need to bring good news to Penny." The following hours were an endless sequence of new tests and procedures. The specialist worked with absolute concentration, requesting tests Lewis had never heard of. Each result was analyzed meticulously, every detail considered with meticulous attention. "There's something we're missing," the doctor muttered more to himself than to the others. "Something that doesn't fit the usual pattern." Lewis observed every move, every expression of the specialist, trying to decipher any clue about Megan's condition. The other doctors seemed to do the same, their tense expressions revealing the gravity of the situation. The sound of the machines had become a morbid symphony, marking the passage of time. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Lewis asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "Is there anything we can do?" The specialist looked up from the test results, his face revealing a concern that made Lewis's stomach sink. The papers in his hands trembled slightly as he approached, his usually neutral expression replaced by something darker. "In 30 years of practice," he began, his voice low and controlled, "I've never seen a combination of symptoms like this." Lewis felt his blood run cold. Years of tough negotiations had taught him to read people, and something in the doctor's posture deeply alarmed him. The specialist went on talking, his words carefully chosen, but each one felt like a hammer blow. "There's a complication," he explained, showing a series of tests, something the normal protocols didn't foresee. The hospital corridor seemed to have grown colder suddenly. Lewis leaned against the wall, feeling his legs weaken under the weight of the doctor's words. The other professionals approached, forming a tense circle around the specialist. "How long?" Lewis managed to ask, his voice almost unrecognizable. "How long does she have?" The specialist adjusted his glasses, a gesture that seemed more an attempt to buy time than a real need. His eyes scanned the exams in his hands again, as if searching for a different answer than the one he had already found. "The problem is not how long," he finally said, his voice laden with a gravity that made everyone hold their breath. "The problem is what we're facing." The monitors continued their monotonous chant in the background, a constant reminder of the life hanging by a thread. Lewis approached the ICU glass, observing Megan's pale face, so similar to his daughter's. The specialist positioned himself beside him, his presence carrying the weight of decades of medical experience. "Mr. Grant," he began, his voice low but clear, "what we've found here is something I've never seen before." Lewis turned slowly, facing the doctor's gaze. The hospital corridor seemed to have stopped in time, each second stretching infinitely as he waited for the explanation. The specialist held the exams as if they were a bomb about to explode, his face a mask of professional concern that barely concealed something much more disturbing. "Just say it," Lewis demanded, his voice shaking. "What did you find?" Meanwhile, the handcuffs chafed Penny's small wrists as she was led through the cold corridors of the police station. Her tears had dried, leaving dirty trails on her tired face, but her eyes retained a desperate gleam. The officers guided her firmly, ignoring her sobs and repeated pleas. "Please," her voice was hoarse from crying. "I need to know how my mother is. Can someone call the hospital?" The booking process was a torture. Every question answered, Every photo taken, every tiny fingerprint collected was a precious moment lost away from her mother. The fluorescent lights of the station made her eyes burn, but not as much as the tears she refused to shed. "Just one call," she repeated to every passing officer. "I just want to know if she's alive." The cell was small and cold, with a concrete bench leaning against the wall and a tiny barred window up high. The metallic sound of the door closing echoed like a final sentence. Penny huddled in the corner, her still handcuffed hands trembling as she hugged her own knees. "Mommy," she whispered into the void, "please don't die while I'm in here. Please just hold on a little longer." The hours dragged like an eternity. Each time footsteps approached, Penny would run to the bars, renewed hope shining in her eyes. But the officers would walk right by, some avoiding her gaze, others simply ignoring her. "I just need to know if she's okay," she would plead, her voice growing weaker with each attempt. "Please, someone help me." Fatigue was starting to weigh on her shoulders, but Penny refused to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's pale face on the floor of the house, her lips blue, her body motionless. The handcuffs jangled against the bars as she fidgeted restlessly, the cold metal a constant reminder of her helplessness. What if she dies alone? The thought tortured her. What if she wakes up and I'm not there? At the hospital, Lewis listened intently to every word from the specialist, his face growing paler with each explanation. Megan's condition was more complex than they had initially thought, a rare combination of factors that rendered conventional treatment ineffective. The doctor gestured over the scattered exams, pointing out anomalies that only he seemed to comprehend. "There is a possibility," he said, hesitant, "but I need to be honest about the risks." Lewis watched Megan through the ICU glass as the specialist explained the complexity of the case. The monitors continued their rhythmic chant in the background, each irregular beep making his heart skip. The exams in the doctor's hands showed a condition he had never seen before, a disease that was spreading in a unique and aggressive way through her body. "It's as if each organ is responding differently," the specialist explained, his voice grave. "Conventional treatments aren't being enough." The businessman ran his hands over his tired face, his mind divided between the unconscious woman in front of him and the haunting image of Penny being led away in handcuffs. The specialist began detailing a new possibility, an experimental treatment, still in testing phase for extreme cases like this one. "There is a chance," the doctor said, carefully choosing his words. "But I need to be absolutely honest about the risks." The procedure was revolutionary, yet with each word from the specialist came the weight of uncertainty. Previous results were limited, and it had never been attempted in a case as advanced as Megan's. "Her body is very weakened," the doctor warned, pointing to the monitors. "The treatment itself could be fatal." Lewis stepped closer to the glass, observing Megan's pale face so similar to his daughter's. The tubes and machines keeping her alive seemed too fragile for the battle ahead. "And if we do nothing?" he asked, his voice betraying the fear of the answer. "How long does she have?" The specialist positioned himself beside him, his eyes also fixed on the patient. His grave expression said it all before the words even came out. "Without drastic intervention, she doesn't survive the next week," he replied with the raw honesty the situation demanded. "Every organ is failing, one after the other." The heart monitor data danced on the screen, each oscillation a reminder of the life hanging by a thread. The specialist continued explaining how the experimental treatment would work, an intensive process that would require Megan's body to fight like never before. "If she survives the initial procedure," he explained, his voice heavy with responsibility, "we'll still have to wait and see if there's a response, and even then..." Lewis closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision crushing his shoulders. The image of Penny crying in the police cruiser wouldn't leave his mind. "I can't waste any more time," he thought, guilt gnawing at him from the inside. "But if something goes wrong during the treatment..." The specialist sensed his hesitation and leaned in closer, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Mr. Grant, I need you to fully understand. Even if she survives the procedure, the chances of full recovery are minimal. And the process..." He paused meaningfully, weighing his next words. "The process will be extremely painful for her." Lewis opened his eyes, staring at the doctor with an intensity that made the specialist take a step back. The decision in his hands was literally one of life or death. risking everything on a treatment that could kill her, or watching helplessly as she withered away slowly. "And if she dies during the treatment?" he asked, his voice nearly unrecognizable. "How will I explain to Penny that her mother died while we were trying to save her?" The specialist had no answer for that question. The silence in the ICU was broken only by the beeps of the monitors and the whisper of the ventilators. Megan continued her silent struggle, oblivious to the impossible decisions being made about her life. The doctor finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "If we don't try, she dies. If we try, she may die. The only difference is that, with the treatment, there's a chance." Lewis stared at the specialist with renewed determination, his voice leaving no room for doubt. His eyes, normally cold and calculating, now burned with a different intensity. "Do the treatment. Use everything you can. Try anything that might save her," he ordered, already grabbing his phone. "I'll go get her daughter. She needs to be here in case—" His voice faltered before completing the sentence, the weight of the unspoken hanging in the air. The drive to the police station was torture. Every minute in traffic felt like an eternity, his mind oscillating between concern for Megan and guilt at allowing Penny to be taken away in handcuffs. His personal driver watched him through the rearview mirror, surprised by the unusual agitation of his typically composed boss. "How could I let this happen?" he muttered to himself, nervously adjusting his loosened tie. "How could I have been so blind?" The police station was a grey, oppressive building. Lewis entered like a force of nature, his name and influence opening doors that would normally remain closed. The officers recognized him immediately, their expressions shifting from bureaucratic boredom to respectful attention. "I've come to post Penny's bail. She was brought in here today," he announced, his voice echoing down the corridor. "And I want her out of this station as quickly as possible. I'll pay the bail myself. Her mother is dying and the girl needs to be at the hospital immediately." Penny was huddled in the corner of the cell when she heard the approaching footsteps. Her still handcuffed hands were bruised from pounding on the bars, her face marked by dried tears. When she saw Lewis, her eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and hope. "My mom," she began, her voice hoarse. "She's alive," Lewis replied quickly, watching as the jailer opened the cell. "But we need to hurry. She needs you there." His hands trembled slightly at the sight of the marks the handcuffs had left on the girl's delicate wrists. "I'm taking you to her now." The drive to the hospital was made in tense silence, broken only by Penny's occasional sobs. Lewis watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she seemed even smaller and more fragile in his leather seat. "There's a new treatment," he explained softly. "The doctors are doing everything they can." The ICU was quiet when they arrived, just the rhythmic sound of the monitors filling the space. Penny ran to the window, her small hands pressed against the cold surface. Lewis motioned for the nurses to let him and the girl inside, and his request was granted. The nurses began preparing Penny and Lewis to enter. Mask, cap, sterile gown. "Just a few minutes," the nurse warned. "She's very weak." The moment Penny approached the bed was breathtaking. Megan, as if sensing her daughter's presence, began to move her fingers slightly. Her eyes opened with difficulty, focusing on her little one's face. "My sweet pea," she whispered, her voice faint, barely audible under the oxygen mask. "You came back." Penny held her mother's hand gently, as if afraid of breaking it. Tears streamed freely down her face as she tried to smile. "Mum, this is Mr. Lewis," she said, indicating the businessman watching the scene from the doorway. "He paid for the hospital, for the medicine. He's helping us." Megan turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Lewis's. There was a deep understanding in that gaze, a silent plea that made the businessman's heart ache. "Take care of her, please. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If I could," she whispered, each word a visible effort. "She has no one else in the world, please." Lewis approached the bed, his imposing presence softened by the emotion of the moment. Megan squeezed Penny's hand weakly, her eyes never leaving the businessman's. "Promise," she insisted, her voice growing fainter. "Promise you'll protect my little girl." The monitors began to show subtle changes, the numbers dancing worryingly on the screens. Megan seemed to struggle to keep her eyes open, her breathing becoming more labored. "My love," her daughter called, gathering her last strengths. "Be strong. Mommy loves you more than anything in this world." Penny leaned over her mother, her tears falling on Megan's pale face. Lewis stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "I promise," he said firmly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'll take care of her as if she were my own daughter." Suddenly, a shrill alarm cut through the air. The numbers on the monitors began to plummet rapidly, red lights flashing on various machines. Megan's hand, which was holding Penny's, lost its strength. "Mom?" Penny screamed in panic. "Mom, no, please don't leave me." Lewis barely had time to pull Penny back before the medical team rushed into the room. The sound of the alarms grew louder as urgent voices shouted orders and called for equipment. The last thing Penny saw before being dragged out was her mother's face disappearing behind a wall of white coats. The surgical center turned into an organized chaos as Megan was prepped for emergency surgery. Lewis and Penny were ushered into the waiting room, where time seemed to drag with deliberate cruelty. The girl wouldn't stop trembling, her eyes fixed on the double doors where her mother had disappeared. "She's going to survive, isn't she?" she asked in a choked voice, clutching Lewis's jacket sleeve. "She has to survive." Lewis tried to maintain his composure for Penny, but his own nerves were in shreds. Every time a member of the medical team rushed through the double doors, his heart leapt. The businessman, who always had answers, was now at a loss for words, simply holding the small, trembling girl's hand. "She's as strong as you are," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "And she has the best doctors taking care of her." The hours dragged by like torture. Penny refused to leave her post near the door, as if her proximity could somehow help her mother. Her legs wobbled after so long standing, and Lewis gently guided her to one of the chairs. "You need to sit down for a bit," he insisted softly. "Your mum will need you to be strong when she comes out of surgery." The coffee from the vending machine cooled untouched in Lewis's hands. He watched Penny, who had finally fallen asleep in an uncomfortable position on the chair, exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the day. Her face, even in sleep, retained a worried expression that no child should bear. "How can life change so much in one day?" he thought, draping his jacket over her small shoulders. "Earlier I was her pursuer. Today I'm her only hope." A doctor emerged from the double doors, his face covered by a surgical mask that made his expression unreadable. Lewis leapt to his feet, the sudden movement waking Penny. The doctor approached them, his gloves still stained with blood, making both of their stomachs churn. "The surgery is proving more complicated than we expected," he informed them gravely. "We still have a few more hours ahead of us." Penny began to cry silently, her tears falling on Lewis's jacket that still draped her shoulders. The businessman knelt in front of her, trying to find comforting words where there were none. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he held hers. "Remember what your mother said," he whispered gently. "You need to be strong now." The nurses came by regularly with brief updates that only heightened the anxiety rather than relieving it. Each time the doors opened, Penny straightened up in her chair, her red-rimmed eyes searching for any sign of hope. Lewis alternated between pacing the hallway nervously and sitting beside her, both trapped in their own spiral of worry. "Why is it taking so long?" the girl asked for the 10th time. "Something must be wrong." The clock on the wall seemed to mock them, its hands moving with agonizing slowness. Lewis had given up trying to work on his phone, unable to concentrate on anything but the doors to the surgical center. Penny had fallen asleep again, this time with her head resting on his shoulder, her small body occasionally shuddering with sobs even in slumber. "If there is a God," he thought, staring up at the hospital's white ceiling, "please don't take this child's mother from her." The sudden sound of several people rushing down the hallway made them both startle. Urgent voices called for equipment, and more doctors were paged urgently. Lewis felt his heart turn to ice at the alarmed expressions on the faces of the team rushing into the surgical center. "What's happening?" Penny asked in panic. "Why are they running?" The specialist rushed out through the double doors, but this time he didn't stop to speak to them. His cryptic words to another doctor echoed down the hallway. "We need more blood units now." Lewis felt Penny squeeze his hand so hard that her small nails left marks on his skin. "Blood?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why does she need blood?" The following hours were a blur of constant movement. Doctors and nurses came and went from the surgical center, always with tense expressions and hurried steps. Lewis had lost count of how many times he saw blood bags being rushed inside. Every move the medical team made was followed by Penny's watchful, frightened eyes. "I've never seen so many doctors like this," she murmured, resting her head on Lewis's arm. "Is that good or bad?" A sudden silence fell over the hallway like the calm before a storm. The rushes ceased, the urgent voices quieted, and for one terrifying moment everything was too still. Lewis felt a chill run up his spine as he noticed the hospital staff exchanging worried glances. Something is wrong, he thought, his heart pounding in his chest. This silence isn't normal. Penny suddenly got up, as if she sensed something. Her eyes, swollen from crying so much, fixed themselves on the surgery center's doors with a frightening intensity. Lewis also stood up, instinctively putting a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Faith's going to be all right," he said, wishing he could believe his own words. "Your mother is strong, she'll make it." The specialist finally emerged from the double doors, removing his surgical mask with movements too slow to be normal. His face was marked by fatigue and something else, something that made Lewis's blood run cold. Penny took a step forward, but Lewis held her firmly, recognizing the doctor's grave expression. "Mr. Grant," he began, his voice heavy. "We need to talk." The specialist led Lewis a few steps away from where Penny was sitting. The hospital corridor seemed even more silent now, only the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the air. The doctor adjusted his glasses, his face marked by the fatigue of hours of surgery. "Mr. Grant, I need to explain something very important," the specialist began, lowering his voice. "There is a technique that could save her life, but it's extremely risky. We would need to gradually cool her body down to a specific temperature, and then stop her heart in a controlled manner." Lewis felt his legs weaken, needing to lean against the wall. "Stop her heart? And if you can't get it beating again?" "That's exactly why I need to be completely honest," the doctor continued. "This procedure has never been performed at this hospital. In fact, there are only 3 documented cases in the entire country. If something goes wrong during the cardiac arrest, if we take longer than the calculated time, we may lose her for good," the doctor explained with an apprehensive look. The businessman looked at Penny, who was watching the conversation from afar with frightened eyes. The girl looked even smaller and more frail under the cold hospital lights, clinging to his coat as if it were her last connection to the world. "How much time do we have to decide?" Lewis asked, running his hands through his graying hair. "Minutes at most," the specialist replied. "Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. If we're going to try, it has to be now." Penny then slowly approached Lewis, her small hands twisting the hem of her worn-out t-shirt. The businessman could see the tremor in her lips as she tried to hold back her tears. Penny approached Lewis, her red eyes fixed on the doctors discussing the procedure. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the businessman's arm. "She can't die, Mr. Lewis," her voice came out choked with tears. "She's all I have in the world. Ever since she got sick, she never stopped taking care of me, even when she could barely stand." Lewis watched the girl struggle against the tears, her small body shaking with each suppressed sob. "We're doing everything we can, Penny," he argued, but the girl shook her head in denial. "You don't understand." She gripped his arm tighter, her face contorted with anguish. "She's always been so strong. Even on the worst days of her illness, she would smile and say everything was okay. But I saw how she suffered, how each day became more difficult." Her voice faltered, more tears streaming down. "And now she's in there, alone, and I can't do anything to help." The specialist excused himself, and seconds later returned with the documents, and Penny looked at him in despair. "Please save my mother. She's all I have. Please." Her eyes turned back to Lewis, pleading. "Will you promise to let them try everything? Promise you won't give up on her. My mommy needs to get better. You don't know what she's been through." "At night it was worse," Penny continued, her voice choked up. "She thought I couldn't hear, but I heard her crying in the bathroom. Then when I called out, she'd rush to wash her face and come singing to me, saying, 'It was nothing, my love, just a speck in Mommy's eye.'" Lewis felt his heart tighten with every word. The weight of the decision he had to make seemed even greater now. The specialist remained in respectful silence, the documents still in his hands. But the girl wouldn't stop telling the story, as if it were what she clung to in order not to break down. "My mommy always said I'm as strong as her," Penny whispered, her eyes fixed on the papers in the doctor's hands. "But I'm not strong, Mr. Lewis. I'm so scared." "We're all scared sometimes," Lewis responded softly, taking the pen. Even strong people like your mother." He signed the document. "If this is Megan's only chance, I have to give her and Penny an opportunity to fight." Minutes later, the medical team was already preparing in the operating room, moving with controlled urgency. Through the glass, the monitors showed Megan's vital signs, each beep weaker than the last. "Initiating cooling," the specialist announced, his voice echoing through the room. "Current temperature, 35 degrees and dropping." "We need to reach 30 degrees, the doctor explained, checking the instruments. "Then we'll initiate the controlled cardiac arrest." "Temperature reached," a nurse announced. "Initiating cardiac arrest procedure in 3. Suddenly, before the countdown was over, a shrill, continuous sound cut through the air. The monitors began flashing frantically, their red lights reflecting on Penny's horrified face. "No! Ma'am, hang in there!" the nurse shouted, her gaze fixed on the monitor measuring Megan's heartbeats. "Please, no, don't stop now, not before the right moment." Chaos took over the operating room as the medical team frantically moved around. The sound of the cardiac monitor continued its single unending tone. Megan's heart had stopped on its own. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Penny gripped Lewis's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the operating room, as if sensing that something was wrong. "Why do I feel that? My mommy won't come back, Lewis. I don't want to live without her," said the girl. Lewis could feel Penny trembling by his side. He wanted to comfort the girl, wanted to give her a consoling word, but he knew he couldn't give a child hope and then break it. "I'll be by your side no matter what happens. Let's pray and hope that everything turns out all right. We mustn't lose faith," he promised, trying to console her, but without giving her empty hopes. The shrill and continuous sound of the cardiac monitor echoed down the hallway as Lewis held Penny back, keeping her from banging on the surgery room window again. The blinds were quickly drawn by a nurse, leaving them with only the distant echo of the medical team's urgent voices and the terrible continuous line of the monitor that still sounded. "Let me go. I need to see her," Penny screamed, struggling in Lewis's arms with all the strength her small body could muster. "Please, let me stay with my mom. She needs to know she's not alone." The hospital corridor, normally a place of order and calm, had turned into a scene of controlled chaos. Nurses ran with emergency carts, their wheels screeching against the linoleum floor. Doctors were being paged over the loudspeaker, their voices echoing metallically through the empty hallways. "Charging!" The specialist's voice sounded muffled through the walls. The sound of the defibrillator being prepared made Penny flinch, clinging to Lewis as if he could shield her from reality. "I don't want to hear that," she sobbed, covering her ears. "I don't want to hear them hurting her," said the girl, her eyes full of tears. "They're not hurting her," Lewis tried to explain, his voice trembling. "They're trying to bring her back to you." A nurse rushed out of the room carrying a tray with syringes and medication vials. Her eyes avoided direct eye contact with Penny as she ran down the hallway. Seconds later, another nurse entered carrying blood bags. The sound of equipment being moved and orders being shouted leaked through the slightly open door. "Adrenaline! Now!" the specialist's voice commanded. The noise of ampules being snapped and syringes being prepared reached them in frightening fragments. "Why did they close everything?" Penny asked, her nails digging into Lewis's arm. "What if it's the last time I can see her? What if—" "Don't speak like that," Lewis interrupted her, his own voice choked up. "Your mother is strong, remember? She's always fought for you. She'll fight now too," he said, trying his utmost not to show the despair he felt at hearing the worried words of the girl. The sound of the defibrillator rang out again, louder this time. Penny jumped at the sound, burying her face in Lewis's coat to muffle her crying. The businessman could feel her tears soaking the expensive fabric, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care about material things. "Again! Charging!" The doctor's voice was tenser, Penny and Lewis could hear. A nurse came running out again, this time returning with more equipment. The minutes dragged on like hours in the silent hallway. "Mommy," Penny whispered between sobs, a desperate mantra. "Please don't leave me alone. I promise I'll be better. I promise I'll never steal again. I promise I'll study hard. Just don't leave me," the girl pleaded, as Lewis held Penny firmly against him, feeling his own heart pounding in his chest. The defibrillator's sound cut through the air a third time, causing the hallway lights to flicker. An emergency cart whizzed past them, pushed by two residents who looked as young and frightened as Penny. "Last attempt," the specialist shouted, his voice carrying the weight of decades of medical experience. "Everyone clear," the doctor yelled. The ensuing silence was deafening. Lewis could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven. Penny had stopped crying, as if fearing any sound might interfere with that crucial moment. Then, almost imperceptible at first, a faint and irregular beep broke the silence, so soft that for a moment they thought they'd imagined it. Then another and another. "We have a rhythm!" The specialist's voice sounded exhausted but relieved. "Heartbeats very weak but stable. We need to monitor closely. Prep the ICU," he said. Penny sank to her knees, her legs giving way with momentary relief. Lewis caught her before she hit the floor, his own legs wobbling. A nurse approached with a cup of water, her face showing a mixture of relief and concern. "Why isn't anyone smiling?" Penny asked softly, watching the continued bustling of the medical team. "If she's back, why do they still look so worried?" The monitor's beep continued, but it was so faint they had to strain to hear it. Lewis watched the shadows moving frantically behind the closed blinds, noticing how the specialist kept giving urgent orders. "She's back. My mummy's back," Penny whispered, tears still streaming down her stained cheeks. "But please come back stronger. I need you so much." Lewis held Penny tighter, both of them transfixed by the weak and uneven sound of the cardiac monitor, a constant reminder of how fragile and precious life can be. The corridor gradually returned to its normal routine, but for them the world was still suspended in those feeble and uncertain beats that meant everything. The specialist emerged from the operating room like an exhausted ghost, his blood-stained surgical gown resembling a battlefield. The hospital corridor was temporarily calmer, but the tension in the air was so thick it seemed to make breathing difficult. His hands, normally steady after decades of delicate surgeries, visibly trembled as he removed his sweat-soaked mask. "Mr. Grant," he called out, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the resuscitation. "There is one last possibility, but I need you to fully understand the risks. In Switzerland, a team has developed an experimental drug for cases like this. The results are impressive, 60% recovery in terminal cases. But," Lewis advanced like a predator, sniffing out hope. "How much does it cost? Where do we find it?" "Money is no problem. Just tell me what I need to do." His hands were already searching for his phone in the stained jacket pocket. "It's not that simple," the specialist sighed heavily, consulting his tablet with data on the new medication. "The protocol is still in phase 3 of testing. It's not approved in virtually any country. Regular importation would take weeks, maybe months of red tape. And even if we could," he hesitated, choosing his words, "the side effects can be devastating." Penny, who had silently approached like a small ghost, grabbed Lewis's coat sleeve. Her eyes, red from crying, alternated between the two men. "Why are you talking softly? Is it about my mum? Please tell me what's going on." Lewis knelt beside her, ignoring the state of his expensive Italian suit completely. "Listen, little one," he began, holding her trembling hands. "There's a new, very special medicine that can help your mom. It won't be easy to get, but I promise I'll bring it, even if I have to move mountains." The businessman was already on his feet again, frantically dialing numbers. "Hello? It's me. Remember that favor you owe me from the mining case? I need your contact at the Swiss embassy." "Yes, now, no, it can't wait until tomorrow. It's a matter of life and death," he said. While waiting for the call transfer, Lewis was already typing messages on another cell phone, activating his international network of contacts. The specialist watched the frantic activity with a mixture of admiration and deep concern. "Mr. Grant," the doctor tried again, "the side effects. We've had cases of severe rejection, severe anaphylaxis, multiple organ failure. In one of the trials, the patient..." His voice failed. "The patient didn't survive the first dose." Lewis seemed not to hear the doctor's warnings, absorbed in a complex international logistics operation. His fingers flew over the cell phone screen as he alternated between English, Spanish, and French. On the other phone, he maintained a conference with executives of his company in Europe. "I don't care about the price," his voice thundered down the hallway. "Mobilize the Geneva branch. I want someone inside that lab in 15 minutes. Yes, use the company jet. No, it can't wait until morning." Penny curled up in one of the hallway chairs, hugging her knees. The faint, irregular beep of her mother's heart monitor seemed to count the seconds remaining. "Please don't give up," she whispered into the void. "Just a little longer, Mom." The specialist took advantage of a moment between calls to continue his warnings. "Even if we get the medication, you need to understand. The protocol requires a series of prior tests, compatibility tests, patient preparation. We're taking an immense risk he said, but Lewis cut him off abruptly. "How long has she had without the medication?" he asked, sweat dripping down his forehead as he awaited the answer. The doctor consulted the latest tests, his face grave. "Her organs are failing rapidly. 3, maybe 4 hours at most. But I insist, we need to consider the risks. The allergic reaction can be immediate and fatal." A nurse approached with more test results, all marked in red. The specialist examined them quickly, his face paling even more. "The situation is deteriorating faster than we predicted. The left kidney is no longer responding. The right one is." "I got it!" Lewis practically shouted, interrupting the grim diagnosis. "The lab agreed to release a dose. My pilot takes off from Geneva in 10 minutes. James is arranging the special authorization from the regulatory bodies." The next 2 hours turned into a torture of waiting. Every 15 minutes, Lewis received updates on the plane's position. Penny didn't leave his side, as if the businessman was her last anchor to hope. "Do you think it will be in time?" she asked for the 10th time, her voice small and frightened. "What if the medicine doesn't arrive? What if—" "It will arrive," Lewis replied with a certainty he didn't feel. "I have powerful friends in Europe, they'll help too." The specialist used the waiting time to prepare his team. An entire room was adapted for the administration of the medication, equipped with all possible emergency equipment. With each new monitor installed, the fear in Penny's eyes grew. "Why do they need so much equipment?" she asked, clutching Lewis's hand. "Is it that dangerous?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of blades cut through the air. A helicopter landed on the hospital's helipad, bringing the precious cargo. Lewis let out a sigh he didn't know he was holding. The special messenger arrived breathless, carrying a refrigerated briefcase. The small vial inside it, no larger than a thumb, seemed insignificant for the entire operation it had mobilized. "Last chance to reconsider," the specialist warned, preparing the medication. "Once we start—" His voice died at the end. "Do it. If she doesn't get this medication, she'll die. I know the risks, but I'll do everything possible for her to survive, and I expect you to do the same," Lewis ordered, holding Penny close. The first minutes after administration were tense silence. Megan's heartbeats, previously weak and irregular, began to grow stronger. A rosy color slowly returned to her face. "It's working," the doctor exclaimed, impressed by the speed with which the medication took effect. "Look, her heart is stronger." But the relief lasted exactly 43 seconds. Without warning, the monitors began blaring deafening alerts. Megan's face, which seconds before had shown signs of improvement, began to display red blotches that spread like fire. Her throat visibly swelled, distorting her features. "Severe anaphylactic reaction," the specialist shouted. "Prepare adrenaline, corticosteroids, immediate intubation," he said. Penny ran at the sound of the doctors and began peering through the surgery door's window. She screamed when she saw her mother begin to violently convulse on the bed, the monitors now a chaotic symphony of alarms. Lewis held her tightly, preventing her from running into the room, his own heart racing with terror. The blinds were violently closed, leaving them with only the terrifying sounds of the alarms and shouts from the medical team. The medication that was supposed to be Megan's salvation now seemed to have transformed into her executioner. "Stop!" Penny screamed, pounding Lewis's chest with her tiny fists. "Make them stop! She's suffering! My mum is suffering!" The girl pleaded. The specialist advanced across the room with a syringe of adrenaline in hand, his movements precise despite the chaos around him. Megan's body was violently thrashing on the gurney, the tubes and sensors threatening to come loose with each spasm. The red blotches on her skin now covered her entire face and neck, transforming her features into a grotesque allergy mask. The medical team moved in a frantic dance around her, each executing their function with the precision that only years of experience can provide. "Saturation dropping!" a nurse shouted, her eyes fixed on the monitor. "We need to intubate now or we'll lose her." "We have no choice," the specialist responded, already preparing the equipment. "If we don't act immediately, the reaction will completely close her airways." The following minutes were a race against time. Megan's throat continued swelling, making the intubation procedure increasingly difficult. The specialist maintained an outward calm, but beads of sweat rolled down his brow as he maneuvered the tube with extreme care. The other doctors watched tensely, knowing that a single wrong move could be fatal. Outside the room, Penny's desperate screams echoed down the hallway, penetrating even the thick ICU walls. "Please, Marina, cooperate with me," the specialist murmured, guiding the tube with millimetric precision. "I know you're fighting, but I need you to let me help you." "Pressure rising," the resident alerted. "The adrenaline is starting to take effect." Megan's body was still thrashing, but the movements were gradually losing strength. The red blotches on her skin were slowly fading in intensity, though they still covered much of her body. Lewis held Penny tightly in the hallway, preventing her from bursting into the room, his own heart pounding in his chest as he watched the battle for life through the small door window. "Why is she going still?" Penny asked in panic, her nails digging into Lewis's arms. Is she... "No, little one," Lewis replied, his voice shaking. "The doctors are managing to get the situation under control." The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster. With each new medication administered, the medical team held their breath, fearing another adverse reaction. The specialist never left Megan's side, monitoring every small change in her vital signs. The red blotches were finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a pale and marked skin. "The signs are stabilizing," a nurse reported, checking the monitors for the 10th time. "But she's still very weak." "Keep continuous monitoring," the specialist ordered. "We can't let our guard down now." The sun was already starting to rise when the first signs of consciousness appeared. Megan's fingers twitched ever so slightly, a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed. The specialist was by her side in seconds, checking her pupils with a small flashlight. Minutes later, Penny, who had finally been allowed into the room, held her mother's hand as if her own life depended on it. "Mom," Penny whispered, her face streaked with dried tears. "Can you hear me?" "Easy, little one," the specialist guided. "She's still heavily medicated." Megan's eyes slowly opened, disoriented and confused. The tube in her throat prevented her from speaking, but her gaze met Penny's, and for a moment, everything seemed all right. Lewis watched the scene from the doorway, a lump forming in his throat as he saw the pure love between mother and daughter. It was then that he noticed something strange in Megan's expression, a growing panic that had nothing to do with the tube in her throat. "Something's wrong," Lewis alerted, stepping into the room. "Look at her eyes." "Megan, are you feeling any pain?" the specialist asked, already starting a quick examination. The panic in Megan's eyes grew by the second. Her hands began moving frantically, trying to touch her legs. The specialist immediately realized what was happening and initiated a series of basic neurological tests. Each unanswered test made his face grow more grave as Megan desperately tried to communicate through gestures. "Doctor," Lewis called out, his voice laced with concern. "What's happening to her?" "I need to run some specific tests," the doctor replied, his professional tone barely hiding his own worry. The next few minutes were torture. The specialist tested reflexes and sensitivity at different points on Megan's legs, but there was no response. Penny observed everything with wide eyes full of fear, her small body trembling every time she saw the doctor's face grow more serious. Lewis had approached the bed, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Why isn't she moving her legs?" Penny asked, her voice almost fading away. "Doctor, why is my mom crying?" she asked, her eyes filling with tears as if suffering her mother's pain. "I need to talk to both of you," said the specialist, indicating the private area of the room. The moment of truth came with the cruelty of a slap. The specialist explained with all possible gentleness that the violent reaction to the medication had caused severe neurological damage. The lack of oxygenation during the crisis, combined with the prolonged seizure, resulted in a spinal cord injury. Penny listened in silence, her tears falling silently as Lewis protectively hugged her. She won't walk anymore?" Penny finally managed to ask, her voice choked. "We will do everything in our power," promised the specialist, But yes, at the moment, she is paralyzed. Megan's sobs, muffled by the breathing tube, echoed through the room like a symphony of despair. Her eyes, fixed on her now immobile legs, overflowed with tears that streamed down her pale face. Penny ran back to her mother's side, holding her hand tightly while Lewis remained paralyzed, guilt consuming him from within. The specialist watched the scene with a heavy heart, knowing that this family would never be the same again. "This is my fault," thought Lewis, running his hands through his graying hair. "If I had believed her from the beginning." "It's no one's fault," said the specialist, as if reading his thoughts. "Sometimes saving a life comes at a price we cannot foresee." The ICU room, with its constant beeps and fluorescent lights, witnessed a scene that mixed relief and tragedy. Megan was alive, but her life had changed forever. Penny alternated between crying and trying to smile at her mother, while Lewis remained a silent and protective presence. The specialist began explaining about rehabilitation and future treatments, but his words seemed distant, as if they came from another world. "We'll get through this together, Mom," Penny whispered, kissing Megan's hand. "No matter how, we'll make it," the girl said, tears bathing her delicate face. "And I'll help you every step of the way," Lewis promised, his voice laden with determination. "I won't abandon you now." The hours dragged on in the ICU as the medical team carefully removed Megan's breathing tube. Her first unassisted breaths were painful and shallow, as if each movement cost an immense effort. The specialist closely monitored her, constantly checking her vital signs. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out hoarse and broken, but her first words were directed at the daughter who wouldn't let go of her hand. "Mi amor, I'm glad you're here," Megan whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Why can't I feel my legs?" she asked, terrified, more to herself than to others. "Mom, don't talk too much now," Penny replied, trying to swallow her own tears. "The doctor said you need to rest." The specialist approached with measured steps, carrying the weight of having to confirm his patient's suspicions. He explained as gently as possible about the spinal cord injury, how the violent reaction to the medication had caused neurological damage. With each word, Megan's face contorted into a mask of pain that went far beyond the physical. Lewis watched from the doorway, his body tense like a violin string about to snap. "How will I work like this?" Megan asked between sobs. "How will I take care of my daughter?" "Mrs. Megan," Lewis finally spoke up, stepping further into the room. "I promise you won't have to worry about that." Suddenly, Megan began to stir restlessly in the bed, her words becoming increasingly disjointed. Her once pale cheeks took on a rosy hue that rapidly spread. The heart monitor began registering a faster heartbeat, while beads of sweat broke out on her forehead. Penny backed away in fright when her mother started mumbling about black-winged angels dancing on the ceiling of the room. "Temperature rising rapidly," a nurse alerted. "Her fever is high and increasing," what the nurse said. "Mom," Penny called out in panic, "why is she talking like that?" The room turned into a whirlwind of activity, as Megan alternated between comprehensible and means words, her speech blending into a feverish delirium. She spoke of staircases leading to heaven, of ice butterflies landing on her numb legs. The specialist, however, watched the monitors with growing interest, his expression subtly shifting from concern to something akin to hope. "Why are you smiling?" Lewis asked, noticing the change in the doctor's demeanor. "This fever," the specialist replied, "may be exactly what we needed." As the team worked to keep Megan comfortable, the doctor explained that the high fever could be a sign that her immune system was reacting positively to the treatment. It was as if her body was waging an internal battle, mobilizing all possible defenses. Penny listened intently, her eyes alternating between her mother's flushed face and the constantly beeping monitors. "It's like a war inside her?" Penny asked, starting to understand. "Exactly," the specialist confirmed. "And right now we want her inner army to keep fighting." Megan's hallucinations intensified with the fever. She began singing lullabies, her hands trying to reach invisible things in the air. At times she called for her own parents, long deceased, asking forgiveness for not having been a better daughter. Lewis had to hold Penny back when Megan started screaming about snakes coiling around her paralyzed legs. "Don't leave me," Megan screamed, struggling against imaginary foes. "The snakes, they're squeezing," she said, completely hallucinating. I need to do something, Penny pleaded, struggling against Lewis's arms. A nurse hurriedly entered the room carrying the results of the latest blood tests. Her grave expression made the specialist immediately drop his notes and cross the room in 3 long strides. As he read the report, his face gradually lost color. Lewis, who had learned to read the doctor's expressions in the past few hours, felt his heart turn to ice. "What is it now?" Lewis asked, still holding Penny. "I need confirmation from the lab," the doctor replied evasively, already heading for the door. Megan's delirium seemed to follow the frantic pace of the cardiac monitors. She was now speaking about a garden where fireflowers blossomed from her immobile legs, describing in vivid detail how each petal burned her skin but left no marks. The specialist returned to the room with more tests in hand, his face a mask of professional concern that barely concealed something much more serious. "How long until confirmation?" the nurse asked in a low voice. "We don't have time," the specialist replied, his eyes fixed on the new results. The sun was beginning to set when Megan finally seemed to calm down a bit. Her temperature, still high, had stabilized, but still high. Her words, though still confused, no longer carried the same terror as before. Penny had fallen asleep in an armchair by the bed, exhausted after hours of vigil. Lewis took this moment to confront the specialist in the hallway. "What did you find in her blood?" he demanded to know, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Grant," the doctor began, hesitant, "I need you to understand that we still don't have absolute certainty." The specialist was interrupted by a shrill sound coming from the room. Another alarm, different from the previous ones, began to blare. Megan had suddenly awoken, her eyes wide, fixed on something only she could see. Her voice, now as clear as crystal, cut through the air like a blade. "They're here, for me." "Who came, Mum?" Penny asked, waking up startled. "The angels. They say they found something in my blood," she said. Lewis felt a chill run down his spine at those words. The specialist was already checking the new monitors installed, his expression growing more serious with each number he read. The powerful businessman, used to controlling every aspect of his life, felt completely powerless in the face of the unfolding situation. "How can she know?" the specialist muttered, looking at the tests and then at his delirious patient. "Doctor," Lewis called, his voice trembling slightly, "what exactly did you find?" However, like a storm that finally calms down, Megan's fever began to gradually subside during the early morning hours. The monitors recorded the slow but steady drop in temperature, each 1/10 of a degree less a small victory. The specialist closely watched every change in vital signs, his tired but alert face. The hallucinations faded along with the fever, the disconnected words giving way to a more peaceful and natural sleep. "Fever dropping," the nurse announced, checking the digital thermometer. "Finally returning to normal." The soft light of morning began to enter through the slats of the blinds when Megan opened her eyes, her consciousness gradually returning. Her gaze, once turbulent with feverish delirium, was now clear and focused. Penny leaned over her immediately, while Lewis approached the bed with cautious steps. The specialist initiated a series of basic exams, checking her neurological responses with redoubled attention. "How are you feeling?" the doctor asked, observing her pupils with a small flashlight. "Different," Megan replied, her voice still hoarse. There's something strange in my legs." A tense silence fell over the room as the specialist moved to examine Megan's legs. His experienced hands performed sensitivity tests, pressing different points while closely observing the patient's reactions. Suddenly, Megan let out an exclamation that made everyone in the room jump. "I felt that," she almost shouted, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Doctor, I felt your touch." The exam continued for several minutes, each new area of recovered sensitivity provoking more tears from Megan. Lewis watched the scene with his heart pounding, while Penny practically danced beside the bed. The specialist took frantic notes, his eyes shining with a professional enthusiasm he couldn't hide. "The experimental medication," he muttered, consulting his notes. "The fever must have enhanced its effect." "Does that mean she'll be able to walk again?" Penny asked, hope overflowing in her voice. Encouraged by the new sensations in her legs, Megan tried to move around in the bed. Her muscles, however, did not fully respond to the commands from her brain. Frustration began to show on her face, when she realized that despite feeling the touch, she still could not control her movements like before. "Why can't I move properly?" she asked, growing anguish in her voice. "Calm down," the specialist intervened. "Regaining sensation is only the first step." A team of physiotherapists was urgently called to evaluate the case. Each new test revealed a complex pattern of recovery. Some areas responded well to stimuli, while others stubbornly remained numb. Megan alternated between moments of hope and frustration, her emotions raw with each new discovery. "It's like a map," the lead physiotherapist explained. "Some regions are waking up, others still need time." "How much time?" Lewis asked, vocalizing the question everyone wanted to ask. Megan's determination manifested itself intensely when she insisted on trying to sit up in bed. With the help of the physiotherapists, she managed to get up, but her legs trembled violently with the effort. Sweat poured down her face as she struggled to maintain the position, refusing to give up even when her muscles protested. "I can't give up like this," she muttered through gritted teeth. "I have to make it." However, her daughter grew increasingly worried. "Mom, don't push yourself so hard," Penny pleaded, evident concern in her voice. "Take it slow." The first attempt at standing was a mixture of courage and recklessness. Even with the medical team's protests, Megan insisted on trying. Lewis and a physiotherapist held her firmly while she tried to bear weight on her trembling legs. For a brief moment it seemed she would succeed, but her knees buckled almost immediately. "I've got you," Lewis said quickly, preventing her fall. "I won't let you fall," he said, relieved, but Megan began to protest, tears of frustration streaming. "But I need to," she said. The next exercises were planned more cautiously. The team established a gradual recovery program, starting with simple movements in bed. Each small achievement was celebrated, each new millimeter of movement a victory. Penny never left her mother's side, offering words of encouragement with each attempt. "It's like learning to walk again," the physiotherapist explained. "Every little progress counts," the physiotherapist explained. "But I will succeed, won't I?" Megan asked, exhausted after another session. The day wore on as the medical team continued their tests and evaluations. Lewis had briefly stepped out to make some calls, organizing the transfer of specialized physiotherapy equipment to the hospital. When he returned, he found Megan in a light sleep, while Penny told a nurse about all the places she planned to take her mum once she could walk again. "She's as strong as you are," Lewis said softly to Penny. "She'll overcome this," he encouraged. "I know she will," the girl replied, her eyes shining with determination. "My mom never gives up." The specialist reviewed the latest tests with meticulous attention, comparing the results to his previous notes. His face showed a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction with the initial progress, concern for the long road ahead, and something else he wasn't yet ready to share with the family. "The results are promising," he muttered to himself. "But there's still so much we need to understand," he explained. "And so much we need to monitor," he completed in thought, his gaze turning to the new blood tests on his desk. The hospital room finally found a moment of peace when Megan fell asleep after another physiotherapy session. The monitors kept their steady pace, indicating that she was stable for the first time in days. Lewis watched Penny, noticing how the girl could barely keep her eyes open, her tiny body exhausted after so many sleepless nights in uncomfortable chairs. Her clothes, still the same from the day she tried to rob him, were crumpled and dirty. "You need to rest a bit," Lewis said softly. "Your mom would worry if she saw you like this," he argued, approaching her. "I don't want to leave her alone," Penny protested, but her voice betrayed her extreme fatigue. "What if she needs me?" The businessman gently insisted, explaining that the medical team would take good care of Megan while they were out for a few hours. He promised to take her to eat something decent and then stop by her house so she could shower and change clothes. Penny hesitated, her eyes alternating between her sleeping mother and Lewis, until her stomach audibly rumbled, deciding for her. "Just for a little while then," she finally conceded, kissing her mother's forehead. "Promise we'll come back soon?" she asked, looking hopeful. "I promise," Lewis replied, already guiding her out of the room. "And any changes, the doctors will call us immediately." Lewis's luxury car seemed absurdly out of place on the narrow, dilapidated streets of the neighborhood where Penny lived. When they finally stopped in front of the old building, something was different. The front door was boarded up with wooden planks, and an official eviction notice was posted over them. "No," Penny whispered, her face losing all color. "Please, it can't be," she begged, completely panicked. "Calm down, little one," Lewis tried to soothe her, but she was already running to the entrance. The boards hadn't been properly nailed, leaving a gap just big enough for Penny to squeeze through. Lewis followed with more difficulty, his imposing stature struggling against the narrow passage. The building's interior was dark and silent, a brutal contrast to the life that once pulsed there. Climbing the stairs, they found more eviction notices plastered on the walls, all with the same date they arrived at the hospital. "All our stuff," Penny muttered, her hands shaking as she tried to open the apartment door. "How will I tell her?" the girl asked, crying. The millionaire tried to help her, but she was inconsolable. "Let me see that," Lewis asked, taking one of the notices to read it better. The apartment was exactly as they had left it in the rush to get Megan help. Dirty dishes in the sink, a half-finished cup of coffee, medicine scattered over the kitchen table. Penny ran to the room she shared with her mother, only to find more eviction notices on the unmade beds. Her sobs echoed through the empty walls as she let herself fall to the floor. "I tried so hard," she cried, clutching an empty pill bottle. "I tried selling candies, selling stuff at traffic lights. When I couldn't, I stole just enough for the medicine, but the rent, it was way too high," the girl said, crying. The girl continued crying, explaining between sobs how every penny she earned went straight to her mother's medicine. She showed Lewis a box hidden under the bed, filled with crumpled pharmacy receipts and bills. The businessman examined the papers with a lump in his throat, realizing how absurdly high the medication costs were for a family that could barely afford food. "How will I tell her?" Penny asked, hugging her knees. "She's already suffering so much." The millionaire tried in vain to console her, but he himself didn't know how to handle the situation, as he had many privileges. "You won't have to tell her now," Lewis responded firmly. "Let me take care of this." The shrill sound of Lewis's cell phone cut through the heavy air of the apartment. The hospital's number flashed on the screen, instantly quickening both their hearts. The voice of the specialist on the other end of the line sounded strangely urgent, but not alarmed. His words were carefully chosen, as if he himself didn't believe what he was saying. "I need you to come back immediately," the doctor requested. "Something has happened that, well, I need you to see it with your own eyes." The doctor finished. "Has she worsened?" Lewis asked, as he was already guiding Penny towards the exit. But the doctor gave him a vague answer, asking them to head to the hospital. The journey back to the hospital was tense, with Lewis driving faster than normal while Penny clung to the passenger seat. The girl had stopped crying, but her face still bore an expression of pure terror. The businessman tried to remain calm, but his hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. "Please don't let her die," Penny whispered repeatedly, like a prayer. "Please, not now," she prayed. The hospital parking lot never seemed so far from the main entrance. Penny practically jumped out of the car before it even came to a complete stop, her little legs running towards the ICU. Lewis caught up with her at the elevators, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the floor numbers slowly rise. "Why didn't they just say what it was?" Penny asked, nervously tapping her foot. "Sometimes it's better to see in person," Lewis replied. But even he didn't believe his own words. The specialist was waiting for them at the ICU door, his face an unreadable mask of professionalism. Before they could ask any questions, he raised his hand for silence and motioned for them to follow. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing like a funereal drum on the white walls. "Prepare yourselves," was all the doctor said before opening the room door. "For what?" Lewis wanted to ask, but the words died in his throat when he saw what awaited them inside the room. The monitors maintained their steady rhythm, but something was different. The room seemed more illuminated, as if the very light had somehow changed. And there, on the bed that had once imprisoned a paralyzed body, Megan was sitting alone, her legs swinging slightly over the edge of the mattress, a weak but radiant smile on her face. "My love," she called softly, extending her arms towards Penny. "Stay there," Megan asked, a huge smile on her face. "How ki?" was all Lewis could say, as the specialist was already frantically flipping through his notes. With deliberately slow and careful movements, Megan placed her bare feet on the cold hospital floor. Her toes curled at the chilly touch, a sensation that just hours ago seemed impossible. The specialist instinctively stepped closer to help, but she raised a hand, silently asking him to let her try on her own. "Wait there, my love," Megan said, her voice choked. "I want to come to you on my own legs." Penny remained paralyzed at the door, her wide eyes fixed on her mother's every movement. Her small hands clutched the hem of her shirt tightly, as if needing to hold herself back from running over. "Mommy," was all she could whisper, tears already streaming down her dirty face. The first steps were shaky, like a baby learning to walk. Megan leaned lightly against the edge of the bed, but her movements gained confidence with every inch conquered. The specialist watched in awe, scribbling frantic notes on his clipboard. "It's a miracle," Megan murmured, tears of joy streaming down her face. "My God, it's a miracle!" Lewis held Penny by the shoulders, feeling the girl tremble under his hands. The doctor couldn't contain his own emotion as he checked the monitors. "The treatment," the specialist explained, his voice choked, "worked beyond our most optimistic expectations." The distance between the bed and the door had never seemed so long. Each of Megan's steps was accompanied by the bated breath of everyone in the room. The monitors maintained their steady rhythm, like a soundtrack for that extraordinary moment. "You're doing it, Mom," Penny finally shouted, unable to contain her joy. Lewis could feel Penny leaning forward, as if her little body wanted to run and help her mother, but she restrained herself, respecting that singular moment. Megan advanced with renewed determination, her smile growing with each step. "Yes, my heaven," she replied, now just a few steps away. "I'm coming back to you." When there were only 2 steps left to reach her daughter, Megan's legs faltered slightly. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like she might fall. Lewis made a move to help, but before anyone could react, she regained her balance on her own. "I'm not going to fall," she declared firmly. "Not now that I'm so close." The moment when Megan finally reached Penny will forever be etched in the memory of everyone present. Mother and daughter merged in a desperate embrace, both crying without any attempt to contain their tears. Megan's legs, now steady, supported her as she knelt to be at her daughter's level. "My little warrior," she whispered, covering Penny's face with kisses. "You gave me the strength to come back." The specialist approached cautiously, his eyes alternating between his instruments and the emotional scene in front of him. His years of medical experience had not prepared him for such an extraordinary result. "We need to run some more tests," he said softly, not wanting to interrupt the moment. "But I can say I've never seen a recovery like this." Penny clung to her mother as if fearing she might disappear at any moment. The thought of the eviction weighed on her mind like lead, but she couldn't find the courage to ruin that perfect moment. "You're never going to get sick again, are you?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Promise you'll stay healthy forever?" Lewis watched the scene with a lump in his throat, his mind already working on how to resolve the eviction situation without causing Megan any more stress. The businessman who always knew exactly what to say in any situation now chose his words with extreme care. "Megan," he began, his voice softer than it had ever been, "I have a proposal for the 2 of you." Megan raised her eyes to him, still hugging her daughter, curiosity mixed with a hint of apprehension in her gaze. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now this man whom her daughter had tried to rob was there, looking at them with an expression she couldn't decipher. "What proposal?" she asked, instinctively holding Penny tighter against her. The businessman took a deep breath, adjusting his already crumpled suit in an automatic gesture. Years of tough negotiations had not prepared him for this moment. "My house is too big for just one person," he began, a gentle smile softening his normally stern features. "And I have enough rooms for an entire family. I'd like you 2 to come live with me." Penny felt her heart leap in her chest, the weight of the eviction secret lessening a little. Her small hands gripped her mother's arm as she tried to hold back tears of relief. "Mum," she whispered, her voice trembling, "please say yes. Please." The specialist, who had remained discreetly away, took the opportunity to speak up. "Megan will still need a few weeks of observation at the hospital," he explained, consulting his notes. "The treatment was a success, but we need to make sure there will be no late rejection of the medication." Lewis took a step forward, his imposing presence now carrying a gentleness that no one could have imagined possible days ago. "Enough time for us to prepare everything," he said, looking directly at Megan. "A fresh start for all of us. What do you say?" Megan looked at her daughter, then at the hospital room, and finally at Lewis. Her legs, now miraculously healed, trembled slightly with the emotion of the moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Why would you help someone like us? Why go to that trouble?" The businessman smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his normally austere face. "Because your daughter taught me more about courage and love in a few days than I learned in my whole life," he replied, placing a hand on Penny's shoulder. "And because I promised myself I would take care of you two." Penny could no longer hold back her tears, but now they were tears of joy and relief. The eviction secret that had tormented her so much now seemed less frightening. "Mom," she said, her voice choked, "Mr. Lewis said he has a huge garden. You can plant your flowers there." Megan felt her own tears streaming down as she hugged her daughter again. Fate had charted a strange and painful path, but perhaps, just perhaps, it all had a greater purpose. "Are you sure?" she asked Lewis, still hardly believing the offer. "It's a huge responsibility," she said, and Lewis nodded. The specialist observed the scene with a discreet smile, making his final notes. "Well," he gently interrupted, "I think we found the best recovery therapy possible, a new family." The day of hospital discharge came with the softness of a spring morning. Megan, dressed in new clothes that Lewis had provided, walked through the hospital corridors with firm and confident steps. Penny skipped by her side, unable to contain her joy, while the businessman followed them with a discreet smile on his lips. The specialist was making his last recommendations, but his eyes shone with the pride of one who had witnessed a true miracle. "I'll never forget this case," the doctor said, shaking Megan's hand. "You redefined everything we knew about recovery." The luxury car now seemed different to Penny, no longer a symbol of the man she had tried to rob, but the vehicle that would take them to their new life. Lewis opened the door for mother and daughter with a gentleness that contrasted with his former stern demeanor. "Ready to meet your new home?" he asked, his eyes meeting Megan's in the rearview mirror. The mansion rose imposingly beyond the high iron gates, its elegant lines eliciting gasps of admiration from Penny. The garden, just as Lewis had promised, stretched out in all directions, its flowers dancing in the gentle afternoon breeze. Megan squeezed her daughter's hand, too emotional to speak, as she gazed at the place they would now call home. "It's like a real castle," Penny whispered, her wide eyes reflecting the grandeur of the building. The main entrance, with its marble floor and majestic staircase, made Megan hesitate for a moment. Lewis noticed her discomfort and gently touched her shoulder. "This house had been empty for so long," he said softly. "It needed life, family. It needed you." As they showed the main rooms, Penny ran from one side to the other, discovering every detail with the enthusiasm of childhood. Lewis had prepared a special room for her, with soft-toned walls and a small library. "I hope you liked every detail. I wanted to participate in the choice of every detail," he explained, watching the girl explore every inch of the space. Megan's room was a spacious suite with a view of the garden, decorated in soothing colors and elegant furniture. A side door led to a small office adapted for her physical therapy sessions. "I thought of everything," Lewis explained, showing the equipment. "I want your recovery to be complete and comfortable." During dinner, served in the elegant dining room, Lewis watched as Penny tried to use the cutlery correctly, imitating his movements with childlike determination. Megan helped her with gentle gestures, and the businessman felt his heart warm at that simple scene. "It's amazing how life can change in just a few days," he thought, making a decision. After the meal, Lewis led mother and daughter to the back garden, where a pergola covered in vines created a cozy setting. The soft lights of dusk painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, creating the perfect setting for what he needed to say. "Penny!" he called, his voice charged with emotion. "I need to tell you something important." What followed was a moment that would forever be etched in the memories of the three. Lewis, the powerful businessman who had built an empire, began to speak with an honesty that surprised even himself. "Penny, when you tried to rob me that day, I was a different man. A man who saw the world through the lens of money and power. I judged people by their appearance, social status, by what they could or could not offer me. You were just another street thief to me, someone who deserved punishment and contempt. I wanted to pursue you, humiliate you, make you pay for what I considered an unforgivable offense. But then in that dark alley, you showed me something I had forgotten existed. True courage. Not the courage that comes from power or money, but the one that is born from pure and unconditional love. You, a child who barely had anything to eat, were willing to face anything to save your mother, while I, with all my resources, lived an empty life devoid of real meaning. Your tears that day were not of fear of me, but of fear of losing the person you loved most in the world. And when I finally understood that, something inside me began to change. Every moment I spent with you at the hospital was a lesson in humility and humanity. I saw how you stayed strong even in the toughest hours, how your love for your mother was greater than any obstacle. I used to think that success was measured by the numbers in a bank account, by the cars in the garage, by the power we exerted over others. But you taught me that true wealth lies in the bonds we create, in the love we share, in the courage to do what is right even when everything seems impossible. When I saw your mother fighting for her life, I understood that all my money meant nothing if I couldn't save a life, if I couldn't make a real difference in someone's life. And you, little Penny, with your unwavering determination and huge heart, showed me that sometimes we need to lose something to find something much greater. Today, looking back, I'm grateful that you tried to rob me that day. Because it wasn't my wallet you took, it was my heart. And with it you also took all my prejudices, my foolish pride, my arrogance. In return, you gave me a new perspective on life, a new family, a new purpose. This house now belongs to you too, not out of charity or obligation, but because you taught me the true meaning of home. A home is not made of marble and gold, but of love, courage, and second chances. And if today I am a different man, a better man, it is thanks to you, my little thief of hearts. Penny and Megan listened in silence, tears streaming freely down their faces. The girl slowly got up and, for the first time since she had met him, hugged Lewis with all the strength her little body allowed. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The sun had completely set, but the garden remained illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns. Lewis helped Megan up, noting with satisfaction how easily she moved now. "Well," he said, a genuine smile lighting up his face, "I think it's time to show you the winter garden. Megan, you're going to love it. There's enough space to create a real flower paradise." Penny took her mother's hand on one side and Lewis's on the other, and together they walked through the illuminated garden. The businessman looked up at the starry sky, thinking about how fate had curious ways of teaching us its most valuable lessons. Sometimes, he reflected, we need to get completely lost to find our true path. The sound of crickets and the scent of night blooms enveloped the three as they headed towards the winter garden. Megan watched her daughter, now safe and happy, and then Lewis, the man who had changed their lives in a way they could never have imagined. Life really is a box of surprises, she thought, affectionately squeezing the hand of her unlikely little family. "You know," Lewis said, stopping for a moment to admire the moon that was beginning to rise, "I think in the end it wasn't me who saved you. It was you who saved me." The days that followed Megan and Penny's return to Lewis's mansion were a mix of challenges and discoveries, but also precious moments that cemented a new phase in their lives. The house, once somber and silent, now pulsed with the energy of a family united by unexpected bonds. "Mom, look, I planted the first daisy seeds like we promised," exclaimed Penny, her tiny hands still dirty from the earth as she showed the newly refurbished flower bed. Megan smiled, feeling a wave of happiness and gratitude. Just a few days ago, she couldn't have imagined seeing her daughter so happy and carefree. "You're doing a great job, my flower. This garden is going to be the most beautiful we've ever seen." Lewis approached, watching the scene with a smile he didn't even recognize in his own reflection in the mansion's mirrors. "Penny, you have a talent for this. We'll soon need more space for all the flowers you're going to plant," he commented, his tone light but full of a tenderness few knew. "Do you really think so?" Penny asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "Because I already thought of planting sunflowers right there near the gate. I think it's a wonderful idea," Lewis replied, laughing. For the first time in a long time, he realized that this sound, so rare and forgotten, was a part of him. This place has never been so alive. During the afternoons, Megan and Penny spent hours exploring the nooks and crannies of the vast grounds, discovering small trails and hidden corners together that seemed to be waiting for them. One day they found a small lake with ducks swimming peacefully. "Mum, can we come back here every day, promise?" asked Penny, holding her mother's hand tightly. "I promise, my dear." "This will be our special place," said Megan, feeling her eyes well up with the peace that finally reigned in their lives. It didn't take long for Penny to bring new ideas to improve the house. "Mr. Lewis, can we make a swing tree? So Mom can push me like in the movies?" she asked, her eyes full of hope. Lewis exchanged a glance with Megan, both smiling at the girl's innocence and enthusiasm. "Of course we can, Penny." "And I'll help build it," Lewis replied, determined to be part of every moment. "You're really going to help? I never thought a man in a suit would know how to handle tools," teased Megan, a laugh escaping her lips. "Wait and see, I have some hidden tricks," Lewis retorted with a wink, as he walked away to get the materials. The construction of the swing was a collective project that lasted all afternoon. Megan helped Penny choose the strongest branches, while Lewis, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, hammered and tied the ropes with precision. "Hold on tight, I'll test it first," he said, climbing up with a mischievous smile. "It won't break?" Penny asked, worried but laughing at the same time. "If I fall, I promise I'll make an even better one," Lewis assured before swinging carefully. The swing held up, and soon after, Penny got on, laughing as Megan gently pushed her. The scene was so simple and perfect that Lewis felt a tug at his heart, a new and genuine emotion. "I never thought I'd see this here," he thought, watching the two of them. That night during dinner, Penny talked non-stop about all the ideas she had for the garden and the house. "And I thought we could paint a mural on the entrance wall with flowers and animals. What do you think?" Megan looked at Lewis, who nodded enthusiastically. "I think it's an excellent idea, my little artist. Tomorrow we can start planning everything," Lewis replied. "Yes, it will be the most beautiful mural of all," said Penny, the sparkle in her eyes reflecting the happiness she felt. Megan smiled, gently touching Lewis's hand on the table. "Thank you," said Megan, her voice low but full of meaning. Lewis returned her gaze, feeling his heart warm. "You don't need to thank me. You both brought life back to me." The days passed, and Lewis's mansion was no longer the same. Now the walls held stories of laughter, plans, and a new family forming with every moment lived. "This is just the beginning," thought Megan, looking at her daughter and Lewis, "and I couldn't be happier." Months passed since Megan and Penny moved into Lewis's mansion. Life regained its course, but this time with a renewed glow. Megan, now fully recovered, dedicated her time to social activities and community projects alongside Lewis and Penny. The memories of the dark days they faced served as an inspiration to help other people find hope and new beginnings. Megan started coordinating fundraising events and organizations to support underprivileged families. Her ability to connect with people and motivate them to get involved made each event a success. "You have no idea the difference you can make in someone's life," she said at every meeting, with a sincere smile and a determined look. Lewis also underwent a profound transformation. Alongside Penny, he started a charity project dedicated to helping street children and families in vulnerable situations. Using his influence and resources, he founded the New Dawn organization, which offered shelter, education, and food to hundreds of children. The project grew faster than he could ever imagine, receiving support from friends and business partners who were inspired by his life change. "Mr. Lewis, today 3 more children were brought to the shelter," one of the coordinators informed him, while Lewis and Penny visited the facilities. "Great work," Lewis replied, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Let's make sure each of them receives everything they need. Penny, do you want to help distribute the new books?" "Yes, I can't wait to see their smiles," said Penny, running to get the books with enthusiasm. She became a little leader within the project, helping with tasks and welcoming the new children with a warmth that reflected her own story. Megan, watching the scene from a distance, felt her heart swell with pride. Seeing Lewis and Penny working together to make a difference was a reminder that, despite all adversities, something beautiful and powerful can blossom. "This is the family I never imagined I would have," she thought, wiping away a stubborn tear. Her own contribution to New Dawn was also significant. Megan organized support activities and guided the children with advice and affection, always with an encouraging word and a warm smile. The New Dawn project quickly gained notoriety in the city, attracting volunteers and donors. The facilities were expanded, and Megan got involved as the support initiatives coordinator, ensuring that each child received the attention and care they needed. "You can be anything you want," she said at one of the meetings with the children. "Just believe and work for it. I'm here to help each one of you get there." Lewis's routine also changed. He traded long meetings and business dinners for afternoons visiting shelters and community events. His name, previously associated only with power and fortune, was now synonymous with generosity and compassion. "I never thought I'd see this day," he confided to an old friend at one of the charity events. "Penny and Megan changed everything for me," he said with an emotional voice. "And you changed many lives because of that," the friend replied with a smile. The impact of the project kept growing, and the sheltered children told stories of overcoming and hope. Lewis saw the transformation in every look, every smile, and every word of gratitude. "Mr. Lewis, today I learned to read my first story," a 6-year-old boy proudly said. "I'm very proud of you, little one," Lewis replied, bending down to give a hug. On tranquil nights, when the mansion filled with soft sounds of laughter and conversations, Lewis, Megan, and Penny sat together in the garden under the stars. It was the place where it all began and where their plans for the future blossomed. "Do you think we can do more?" Penny asked, her eyes shining with hope. Lewis looked at Megan and then at his daughter, feeling the warmth of the union they had built. "Always, my little one, and we'll do it together." Megan smiled, holding both their hands. "Together we can do anything." With the success of New Dawn, Lewis received invitations to speak at conferences and share his journey of redemption. He told his story with humility, highlighting how Megan and Penny taught him about the true essence of life. "It's not possessions that define a man," he said in his speeches. "It's what he does to make the world a better place." Megan was also invited to participate in events and share her experiences about solidarity and overcoming adversity. Her words touched the hearts of everyone who heard them. "My story is proof that even in the darkest moments, there is always a light that can guide us," she said in a lecture. "And often, that light is in the people we choose to love and help." The mansion that was once merely a symbol of wealth was now a home full of love and solidarity. The corridors held the voices of children who came to visit, participating in the reading afternoons and lunches that Megan organized. Penny was the hostess, showing the house and sharing stories about how her life had changed. "You can't imagine how it was before," she told the visitors, "but now, here, we find a real home." And in the distance, the voices of the children from the shelter sang, an echo of a brighter future for all. Life went on, with challenges and achievements that strengthened the bonds between them. Lewis, Megan, and Penny hand in hand. If you liked this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.